Hi, this is Bronwyn the Brave, and I'm going to show you how to add beads to your knitting. There are two general ways that you can add your beads. The first is to pre-string your beads by putting the beads on your working yarn directly, even before you cast on. I don't prefer this method for a couple of reasons. Actually three, I think. The first is it's kind of boring and tedious to have to do that before you actually even start your knitting. And you also have to have a perfect count. If you are off, then you're kind of messed up. But it also puts a lot of strain and weight on that yarn by pulling up and down those beads. So I don't really like that. But also it mounts the bead differently. It will only be on one strand of your stitch. The second way actually kind of wraps around the collar, like a collar around one stitch, because the bead actually goes over one stitch. And you can apply those beads in two different ways. One with a tiny crochet hook. This is a size 11 or 1.1 millimeter crochet hook. And the other option is with Superfloss. I just love to say that. It's Oral-B Superfloss. You can buy this at the grocery store. I actually just checked and it was, I think, $3.69 for 50 pre-cut strands. And you could actually even split this among lots of your friends and everybody could bead. Awesome. So two different ways, and I'll show you the crochet hook method first. These are size 6 glass beads. The way that they're labeled is 6/0, but people just say it's size 6. So what that means is that there are 6 beads on average per inch. This size bead I've used on fingering, sport weight, and DK without any problems. I don't think I've ever tried worsted, but you might be able to squeeze it on there. So with a crochet hook, you slip it into the stitch and you slide it over through that. But there are a couple different ways that you can, depending on your pattern. So I think it's important to really pay attention to your pattern, how it's stated, or you might have to make that judgment. The difference is that if you think about it, these are, whoops, I lost my bead. The stitches that are on my left hand needle are actually the previous row, and the ones that are on my right hand needle are on the current row. So if I don't work the stitch, the bead will be placed on the previous row. And I don't really want that to happen, because if you look at my, try to get this lined up, my stitch pattern, over here I did it the wrong way so I could show you how it is oriented. So you can see these purl stitches, those are on the previous row. And here I placed the bead and then I knit the current row. So the bead is actually sitting on the previous row. It's lined up with those 2 purl stitches. But because, you know what a diamond is shaped like, right? So it should be making a point. I want that to be the tip of that diamond. That's the whole point of the diamond. So I actually, for this pattern, want to work the stitch and then place the bead. It just depends on your pattern, and a lot of times it won't be quite as obvious, but for this pattern I thought it was easier to place it on this current row. So I'm going to knit this stitch and then go into the stitch with a crochet hook. It doesn't really matter as long as you keep the orientation the correct way. What I mean by that is that the stitch ends up being mounted correctly when you're finished. So I did have the stitch on my crochet hook, and you pull it all the way up, and I always put some tension on that working yarn back there. Pull it all the way to the hook, and I'm putting quite a lot of pressure to push that bead onto the yarn. So now, because I'm working with the working yarn, I can make that stitch as big as I want to, which is kind of nice actually. You don't have to be concerned about how big that stitch is, since if you're working the stitch below, you don't want it to be out of shape. So now I have this thread, this stitch. I pulled it off my right hand needle. So now I have to figure out how to get it back on. What I usually do is put it on my left for a split second. I actually put my crochet hook in my mouth, but I can't do that while I'm talking. And then I transfer it back to my right hand needle. And before I tighten this up, I pull on the working yarn to see which direction it's pulling. I want to make sure that that stitch keeps its orientation correctly. I don't want it to be twisted, especially if you're working lace. You want that stitch to be able to open up as much as it needs to, the same as around the stitches around it. I can't talk. So that's the crochet hook. The other way is with this Superfloss. Let me get to this next stitch first. And same way, I'm gonna knit the stitch that I want the bead to be on. But with the floss, one of the drawbacks is that you kind of have to put down your work. So you need like 4 hands to do it otherwise. But if you put your work down, it's not a big deal. It's a tiny bit more fiddly, but you also don't risk losing your beads quite as easily, because the bead never actually leaves something to hold it to. So it's either on the floss or on your stitch, one or the other. And this floss is kind of cool. It's got this pointed tip. It's very, very firm and stiff. And then it has this fluffy section. And I've left this strand of floss just loose. I don't even tie a knot in one end. There's a knot on the other end. Not exactly a knot, but I'll show you that in a second. So that you've got the stiff part, the fluffy part, and then a really long section that's a lot more like regular dental floss. And on the end, I'll show you with a colored bead how I keep my beads from falling off. Instead of tying a giant knot and hoping that the beads still can't pass through, I pull a bead and I pass the thread through it 2 more times, and it doesn't really go very far. I can kind of nudge it, but barely. If you pass it once, it'll slide and you still run the risk of losing them. But if you pass it twice, it doesn't go very, very far at all. So I usually load my floss up with a few inches worth of beads, just because I do it all as much as I can. And then, just like the crochet hook method, I put the stiff end of the floss through that stitch. Like I said, it's a little bit more fiddly, but you don't have to worry about smaller holes in your beads. Sometimes the beads are irregular, and well, they're always irregular, but they might have smaller holes. And I've had a couple of beads that are too small for the crochet hook, and I pulled out my floss and no problem. So I have passed the floss through the stitch once, and then I put the stiff end of the floss back through that bead. It's hard to see with the clear, but now I've got this loop. It's 2 strands of the floss through that bead, and I can pull off that stitch safely because I'm holding on to it. And I draw that bead onto the stitch, pull it down, pull my floss out, and be careful not to lose that second stitch. I did that once or twice and realized it almost too late. And then once again, make sure that it's mounted correctly, pull it tight. And I found that if you pull the 3 stitches, one before and one after, and then the stitch that it's on, if you pull it a little bit snug, it will keep it from getting too big of a gap between there. So there is the beaded shawl. Thanks for watching.